I should turn my mic on when I start talking. How about that? Uh, that's a really good idea. I just said a lot of things that probably weren't as important, but maybe next time I'll make sure that my microphone is on. Great. Um, so yeah, so this is gonna be very technical talk. We're gonna talk about some Azure stuff mostly, primarily, and little red teaming techniques or pen testing techniques, just offensive security in general. The talk is called "Gimme the Loot." Let me hold the token a little bit, real quick. Wow, I've got the name of my own title, and it's right here in front of me. So let's start with me. Who am I? So my name is Leron Gray. I'm a senior security consultant at Bishop Fox. I've been here for since August. So like right after DEF CON is when I started. I'm originally from Brooklyn because everybody from Brooklyn got to tell you that we're from Brooklyn. That's just how it works. I've been in offensive security for about 9 years, coming up on 10 very shortly, uh, in a multitude of things. And as I mentioned, senior security consultant at Bishop Fox. My previous roles, prior to this, I was on the Azure Red Team at Microsoft. Uh, Before that, I was a web app pen tester at another place. And before that, I was a blank at the NSA. But none of this is actually really redacted. Like if you looked at my LinkedIn, all the information is there. I just don't put it in slides. Um, and I'm also a PhD uh, candidate at Dakota State University. It's an online program. It's pretty cool. It should be done hopefully fall next year. That'll be Doctor Gray. That sounds pretty cool in my opinion. And I'm also a nerdcore rapper. I do a lot of shows across the country. I actually have shows at South by Southwest like next couple of weeks. It'll be pretty cool. But yeah, there's that. And you can check out some of my music on SoundCloud. Always gotta flex the SoundCloud rapper uh, life. Okay, so here's the agenda. We're gonna talk about some traditional credentials and those like the typical types of passwords that you find in your environment. Then we'll talk about Azure Active Directory credentials or AAD. We'll talk about attacking environments that are only Azure AD, right? That don't have an on-premises component. And then we'll just go through a quick scenario. Then we'll end the session and then answer some questions that you have. I am paying attention to the chat. So if you have questions about something that I'm saying on a slide, feel free to throw that in there. I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible within the context. All right, so traditional credentials. All right, so for this, when I say traditional, I mean the things that you would normally find in Active Directory, right? Those users and machines all have passwords, right? Typically usernames and passwords. Those are the traditional types of credentials that you may find. Or you may find things like if you consider a Kerberos ticket credential. Kerberos is the authentication mechanism which occurs in Active Directory, right? Via a ticketing system. And a lot of those lateral movements is based on finding an interesting target to move to. So if I breach a network or if I start from an assumed breach position, then I'm looking for targets that are interesting. It could be a database, right? It could be the domain controller, of course. It could be in a hybrid environment. It could also be the Azure AD sync server, right? But typically, the goal in an on an on-premises engagement is to get domain admin, right? Everybody wants domain admin because that's where all the powers are. And then you take over the domain, you dump hashes, and you quote win, right? That's the way that it goes traditionally. And phishing, the initial access happens in a couple of ways. You typically have things like phishing, right? Sending emails or stuff like that. There's supply chain attacks. Maybe if I have access to something that I know that you're using, like SolarWinds, right? That's a supply chain attack. If I can exploit your services or applications that are exposed to the internet, or if I go ahead and drop some USB drives in your parking lot, right? These are all ways to get initial access in a traditional environment. Usually for phishing, you want someone to get like an executable or a document and they open it up and now they're exploited, right? And the traditional Windows post-exploitation involves looking for things like passwords and documents on disk for like the client versions. Um, for Windows Credential Manager, which is where a lot of your credentials are stored on Windows machines, right? You have the DP API or DPOPI protected credentials, which are sort of user context based. So if I'm another user on a system as you, I can't unprotect your credentials without being in your context. And then you have things like password managers, FTP credentials, anything that you might use to connect to a remote system, you would find on a Windows client machine. Um, for the server versions, uh, they're the same as the client, but you usually focus on the credentials that are applicable to that service. So if it's a web service on Windows, then it's probably IIS, right? Or if it's a database, it's probably MS SQL. And typically, a lot of these servers on these networks are set up by users who are administrators, and so a lot of the times they might leave some passwords behind on disk, or maybe their credentials themselves will be in memory. There's a question about golden tickets in Azure. There is not a golden ticket, but there is a concept of called a silver ticket in Azure, and that is a separate talk in itself. But you can look that up. It's called Azure Silver Ticket, and you'll find some information about that. And then for your Windows exploitation, of course, you want LSAS, right? That's where all the credentials are stored, and that's where you run Mimikatz, and you get your credentials, your hashes, your tickets, your certificates, things like that. And then, of course, you also have your network-based attacks, right? Things like Responder, which you can use to capture NTLM v2 hashes, which are used to authenticate right and users in sort of a challenge system, or you can just sniff the traffic for plain text credentials. Um, Alternatively, you can do attacks against the domain, things like Kerberoasting, right? We talk about Kerberos. Uh, I'm sorry, we talk about Kerberos and that authentication system. There's an attack called Kerberoasting, which is explaining that sort of outside of the scope of this talk. And then there's things like Active Directory certificates, services templates, which is a very common technique now and sort of like overlooked by a lot of administrators. And then you have some other really cool user to domain admin attacks in the last couple of years, a lot of printer exploits and things like that. These are all things that you can do on a traditional Windows network. Um, but when it comes to LSAS, it's usually the primary focus for an attacker, right? You always want to get an elevated shell or whatever, and you dump LSAS and you have more credentials. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But these credentials are usually used to escalate your privileges or laterally move across the domain. And getting local admin on like very locked down targets when it comes to certain EDR products, it can be very difficult to even get local admin. But if you're in an active Azure Active Directory environment that does not have a domain, meaning that all your users, maybe you're a small company, all of your users just have like their laptops that they connect and authenticate with to Azure Active Directory, but there's no domain that you own. You don't own any infrastructure like that. The question uh, is getting access to LSAS that's critical? And it may not be because uh, there's likely aren't any credentials that you can use to laterally move. Matter of fact, your users never have to be on the same network at all, right? If I work from home in in my apartment, and somebody else is working from their house, their residence, right? We're part of the same Azure Active Directory, but we don't have a logical connection to each other other than that, right? There's no way from my computer to talk to their computer, and so do things like LSAS really matter in that context? Uh, there is something that is in LSAS called the primary refresh token, which can be used for persistence, but we'll come back to that. So for Azure AD credentials, right? So Azure AD, if you're unfamiliar with it, is an identity service, and it's basically like Active Directory, but in a cloud environment. Azure Active Directory and Active Directory can talk to each other, but they're not the same thing. So you have to be very careful when you're speaking about certain things about which one is which. Um, Azure Active Directory can hold the same things like AD, right, such as users, service accounts, but in the cloud, they're known as service principals. And then you have things like groups or managed identities, and a managed identity is an identity that you can give an Azure resource, like a virtual machine. And then you have like your devices, which are the things that you can join to Azure Active Directory. So it could be your laptop, your MacBook, your phone, your mobile device, things like that. Um, these roles, there are things called roles that can be given to these identities, right? And they're no different than saying that you're given this role and now you can control this other object that's also an Azure Active Directory, right? Um, and a lot of times those can be really easy to mess up, but that's another topic. And then here we have this concept called a global admin. It's sort of like a domain admin. It's basically like a domain admin equivalent, right, for Azure Active Directory. So that is basically in the Azure context, you don't care about domain admin because there aren't domain admin, but you want the global admin because that gives you basically almost all the power to do whatever you want to a particular tenant. So for this talk, the rest of this talk, we're going to assume that everything that we're talking about when it comes to an AAD environment is just pure AAD, right? There's no hybrid environment. We're not worried about like Azure AD Sync. We're not worried about Active Directory. We're not talking um, well, yeah, things like that. We assume that maybe there's an Office 365 license, right? That they have things like Word and PowerPoint. And then we're going to also assume that there aren't really a lot of Azure resources, right, to mess with, right? They maybe have some storage accounts or something like that, but we're just going to assume that there aren't a lot of resources for us to be that concerned with. So we're only talking here about Azure Active Directory. Oh, and actually keep in mind, Azure and Azure Active Directory are two different things. I just want to make this clear. Azure is the system and the service in which you provision a resource, like a virtual machine or like a storage account, or like a key vault, right? That is the resource managing service. Azure Active Directory is the identity service, but they do interact, right? So you can have your members in Azure Active Directory have different roles or permissions on resources that are provisioned in Azure. This is very important because depending on who you're talking to, some people sort of like to just conflate Azure as everything, but it's not. And so it's very important to just to know for your future, I guess. So let's talk about how authentication works. And it's the authentication for AD is no different than anything that's almost no different that anything that's in the OAuth 2 protocol standard. And that's also a separate topic. But basically, here's the things that happen. You, as a user, open your browser and you go to this web page that is hosted in Azure, right? So we'll say uh, uh, bishopfox.azurewebsites.net, right? That doesn't exist, but let's say it did. So you navigate to this web app. This web app says, okay, in order to access this, you need to authenticate against Azure AD. So you go ahead and do that. You enter your credentials, right? You enter your username and password and your MFA because you should have your MFA enabled, right? Right, right. So you enter your username, your password, your MFA, and Azure returns these things to you called an access and a refresh token. An access token is a short-lived token that lasts typically about an hour, and it shows that you currently have the ability to access this resource. A refresh token is used to sort of re-authenticate yourself when your access token expires. So access tokens are short-lived. Refresh tokens are longer-lived. They're about 90 days long by default. And so you use your refresh token to request an access token to access the resource. And then where are we? Five, right? So yeah, so the access token goes to the web app. The web app does whatever it needs to do with it and verifies that you're the right person and validates that access token. And then you get sent back to your user page. So these are the steps that are used to authenticate just normally to a web page. The question from chat is, can an access token or refresh token be used in a pass the hash attack? And the answer to that is no. Not in the traditional sense that you're thinking of. And really, actually, not at all. Pass the hash is something that's used on Active Directory domain, but we're assuming in this conversation that there is no Active Directory domain to begin with. And also, those are the wrong types of credentials. But if you do happen to steal an access token, you can use it to authenticate to the same resource that the user was able to authenticate to, assuming that they don't have the protections in place like uh, what is continual access evaluation or something like that. I forget what it's called. It's a new service that's offered at by Microsoft. But if you steal a refresh token or if you steal an access token in your pen test or your red team, you can use that outside of the context of the users, right? So you can put that in your own computer and use that. There's plenty of tools out there, and that's another conversation to have, really. But Remember we talked about LSAS, and I said I was going to come back to this thing called the primary refresh token. Well, the primary refresh token is what's used to authenticate your device, right? So if you join a device to Azure AD, like a laptop or a phone, you get this thing called a primary refresh token, and the keys, the private keys, are backed by TPM, which is a module used to hold cryptographic materials, right, on your computer. It lasts 14 days and it's actively renewed about every 4 hours. When you request an app for like single sign-on, so like if my device is joined, and let's say I open up my browser and I want to go to portal.azure.com, well then whatever browser I'm using is actually going to request the application from my computer and say, hey, is there a token? Oh, please give me a token for this so that I can use it. These tokens are um, didn't mean to highlight that. They're regular refresh and access tokens, but they're saved on disk in a cache somewhere. And then but they're sort of derived from the primary refresh token that authenticates your device. There's a lot of research about this, and it's a very long conversation. If you are interested more in the primary refresh tokens and what they can do, I would suggest following these two accounts, Dirion and Dr. Azure AD on Twitter, because they post a lot of research and they have a lot of really good blog posts about like super advanced Azure Active Directory attacks. So what do we care about? Well, in Azure AD, we care about usernames and passwords, right? If the user doesn't have their MFA enabled, congratulations, right? You now have stolen an account. If they do have MFA enabled, right, you can do a little social engineering or maybe spam uh, their MFA prompts, right, until they just get tired and eventually click it. This works, surprisingly, right? This actually works, right? People get tired. It's called MFA fatigue. People get tired of getting these notifications. They're like, okay, fine, whatever. Um, but yeah, you'd be surprised. And the access tokens, like we mentioned, are short-lived, but you can do something, whatever the audience that is for, and the audience means the application. Whatever the audience is for, you can use it for that. With the refresh token, then you have it for 90 days, and you can request access tokens for whatever resource the refresh token was for. Um, and these are both things that are attained post MFA, right? So as I mentioned, you can take this off your victim computer and put it on your own computer and use it because the MFA authentication has already occurred, and these are the credentials that represent that post MFA life. Right? Excuse me one second. Right, and then you have the primary refresh tokens, which are the hardest to obtain, but they are the most powerful type of credit listed here. Right, you will need Mimikatz in order to obtain it, which is why we talked about before. Mimikatz can be hard, particularly on some Azure AD environments. So if we talk about attacking only these environments, we have to consider a couple of situations, right? On a traditional network, we're logically connected, right? Or like on a network, I have an IP address on a network or a subnet. You have an IP address on the same subnet. We're part of the same domain, all right? And then we can talk about like attacks against the domain itself. Um, Users that are connecting devices to a domain, like your computer, are considered the owner, device owner, but they may not be the primary users, right? There can be multiple users, like jump boxes that you have on a traditional network. And then things like group policy or a lack of permissions can help restrict lateral movement, which can be sort of a pain, right? Sometimes. But in Azure Active Directory, these devices don't necessarily, as I mentioned before, don't need to have a logical connection. Um, you can't really attack Azure AD as a local service. And again, we're not talking about places that have Azure AD sync or hybrid environments. We're talking strictly Azure AD environments. Um, and again, users that connecting may be the device owner. They may not be a primary user. And then things like conditional access or Intune may restrict your authentication location. So they're very similar, but you have to consider how the technologies are implemented against uh, traditional or Azure Active Directory environment. And again, so answering this question before, right? Someone said, "Can we do pass the hash?" The answer is not. No, not really. Um, in a traditional environment, the pass the hash, right, is you're passing your NTLM hashes, and to authenticate, you can't do that in Azure AD. Uh, in a pure Azure AD environment, you can't do that. Same thing for pass the ticket, which is like Kerberos, right? Passing Kerberos tickets, right? You can't really do that. You can. Um, it's a complicated scenario that we're not going to talk about here. but there are certain endpoints in Azure that accept Kerberos tickets, and you can authenticate that. Again, we talked about the Azure Silver ticket earlier. Look that up. And here's all these other type of techniques that may or may not work in Azure AD, but you see that the majority of them don't work, right? On the left, we have the traditional attacks that you would normally use. And then on Azure AD, none of these really work except browser cookies, right? So we talked about I need an access token for my browser. Well, browsers don't work with access tokens; they work with cookies. So you can find cookies in the SQLite database for the browser that's related to, right? And you can steal those, right? If you understand that technique. The question is, how do we attack Azure AD environments? Well, first thing we need to do, we need to enumerate users. Uh, you can look through LinkedIn or you can Google. Let's say you looked up, I'm going to use Bishop Fox, say bishopfox.com, and you start looking for users. You can find things in LinkedIn, you can find things in Google. But the better way to do it is to ask Microsoft, right? And by Microsoft, I mean a Microsoft service, not them directly, if the user exists. And there are different ways of doing this. There's all these types here. I'll briefly go through them because I want to not spend too much time on it. But uh, if I ask login.microsoftonline.com, hey, does this user exist? Uh, and I may either get yes, the user does exist because you got the password correct, or the password is incorrect. Sometimes there is a pre-step where you put in an email address and then it sort of says, okay, well, now that you authenticated, now that you put in the email, now you actually need to authenticate. Depends on how the configuration for the tenant is set up. But there's all sorts of scenarios that are considerations to have when you do something like that. And then you try to log in as the user, right? It creates a login event in Azure AD. So it's really noisy. You can try doing it through the SSO endpoint uh, if the SSO is enabled. And there's all sorts of other things there too. My favorite two are OneDrive and Team Search. So OneDrive, uh, if you open up OneDrive on, if like you have to actually use it in order to sort of for it to show up. But if you open up OneDrive, then you get this URL for your OneDrive, right? It's a tenant, whatever your tenant name is, that SharePoint.com personal, and then your username and domain, and the top level domain. So for me, it'd be something like whatever my username is, underscore Bishop Fox underscore com, right? And so if I've used OneDrive, then this URL is going to exist. I won't be able to access it, but the fact that it exists tells me that the user exists. Does that make sense? So if you try to look up like a non-existing user, right, you're going to get like a 404, right? User URL not found. But if the user does exist, you're going to get like a 401 or a 403 saying that you're not authorized to access it. And then the other thing is team searching, which allows you to message user. Well, it's sort of twofold. You can message by default. External users can message organizations uh, over Teams. It's by default. But these are like perfect for phishing. Um, there's things like phishing through Outlook, through like the traditional payload, or phishing through Teams. Again, if the organization allows you to contact members of that team. And then there's the types of payloads, right? It could be a link to a website, type in your username and password. It can be a link to a malicious Azure AD application, which is another different topic. Um, Malicious Office document, right, with macros, which are less common these days, but still possible. Or just like download this executable and run it, please. And then again, we talk about lateral movement, which is different for Azure AD because you have these refresh and access tokens, which isn't really lateral movement per se, but it's sort of a way to persist, right? But things like like storage keys or database connection strings are laterally moving from one device to another. So you should consider those to be lateral movement if you happen to find those in like a repository or in like process memory or something like that. And then malicious Azure AD applications are another topic, but there's all sorts of keys for different Azure resources. But again, we're assuming that there aren't that many Azure resources in this environment. So here's a scenario. We have this company called Wacky Vacuums, and their tenant name is WV1T3. This is a random generally name and then whatever. So it's not like a real. This does exist, but it's not like a real company, right? So everything that you see in this company is not real. Just we're gonna say that. They only have Azure AD. They don't have any resources in Azure. They have a Microsoft 365 license, so they use Word, PowerPoint, Teams, SharePoint, etc. Their users are Intune managed. So when you try to like when they join, the whole bunch of when they join a device, a whole bunch of policies are set, right? And the users don't have local admin on their company laptops. So they're trying to get things like the primary refresh token is going to be very difficult to do. Um, and then users have a variety of AD roles, right, depending on their job, right? So we looked at LinkedIn and it says one employee runs the help desk. So why the help desk, right? There's actually a AD role called help desk administrator, which has the ability to reset passwords um, for users who are not global admins or require higher permissions than the help desk administrator. It's sort of a tiered password reset system, but like for a normal user, this help desk administrator can uh, 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 reset the password, right? So we don't need to drop a full payload or a C2 or anything like that. All we really need to do is get their refresh token or their access token. So how do we confirm that this person exists? Well, we're going to start with Teams enumeration, right? Because this company isn't secure and they forgot to turn that off. Um, but the question is, how do we determine the username format? Because different companies have different formats, right? It could be first name dot last name. It could be first initial last name or last first name uh, last initial. It could be all these sorts of different ways to do it. So here's a quick video of trying to do that with trying to do this with Teams. So I know that the person's name is Megan Bowen, and notice that I'm coming from my personal Gmail account, right? I'm outside of their organization. That's just me. I go up and look up M Bowen at the tenant at the Wacky Vacuums tenant, and you'll notice that I made a typo, so I had to backspace. Um, and you notice that nothing shows up, right? Which means that user doesn't exist. If I try Megan.Bowen, that also doesn't show up either, right? So the user doesn't exist. But if I type Megan B, well, now you get this little prompt here, this little thing that says, hey, Megan Bowen exists. You can send them a message, right? So this is sort of enumeration that's easy to do um, because it just requires you just typing in names. You can automate this, but that's also outside of the scope of this conversation. So uh, what do we do next, right? So we've confirmed the user format, which is first name, last initial. And then, as I mentioned, you can sort of automate this. So I generate a whole bunch of different names and start just looking for similar accounts. And I do this in Python because Python is the best scripting language, right? And I get all these users. Now keep in mind, it says Microsoft tenant name. These are just like usernames that come from the Microsoft like sample pack that they give you. And so you can sort of like enumerate all these names. And here's a nice little spreadsheet. And now I have more users that I can contact or phish or whatever. You do want to be careful because the user principal name doesn't always need to match the email tenant. So you want to make sure that if you are phishing and you want to stay in scope, you should stay in scope, use the user principal name instead of the email. So we only care about getting the access tokens for the help desk user. And again, we talked about earlier about the Azure AD applications and executables, but I want to use an Office document because I want them to run some macros. This is something I'm really proud of, and it took me a very long time to do it. I was up for like 2 days trying to figure this out because I don't write in Visual Basic ever. This is my like first time trying to write something. But here's what a macro does, right? A macro is something that you can embed in a document, and when a user clicks on this document, it will run if they enable the macros, right? So basically, what's happening here is I am creating this macro so it runs when the document is open, and that's sort of defined here by the document open function. And then I'm looking for this regex, and this is EYJ0EX, which indicates the presence of a JSON web token, which is the structure for access tokens, right? So I'm looking for access tokens, but where am I looking for it? I'm actually looking for the access tokens in the memory regions of the Word application. Like I don't need to touch if they have an Office 365 license, I don't actually need to touch any other process or any files on disk in order to get uh, their access tokens, because Word, right, or PowerPoint or whatever, all connect to Office 365. And to do that in the user context, they also need access tokens, right? Does that make sense? The application wants to make sure that you are authenticated. And so inside of that process memory, there is an access token. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm scanning the regions of memory of the Word application itself, right? And I'm looking for any string that has EYJ0EX, and I extract those. And then over here on the right side, I just I don't mean to do it like that. On the right side, I sort of email it to myself, right? So I create this little email, and for every match that I find, and I sort of limit it to 100, I just send an email to myself. This implies that Outlook is installed on their system. It doesn't have to be, but you can exfil however you need to exfil, right? I just chose to use Outlook because it's probably there. Um, and so this is really cool because now I don't actually have to touch anything on disk. I don't have to touch another application. I can just ask the application itself, hey, what access tokens do you have? Right. There are other ideas too. We're not gonna get too much into these, but you can replace the user's macro default template with like another template. But and then or you can get the token broker cache files, which is where the applications that request tokens like Office or stuff like that put their tokens in, and it sits on disk, depoppy encrypted. So here's the goal, right? So I want to attack this user. I say, hey, here's my message. Hi, Megan. And this is what they see up top, right? They see this first, right? I want to chat with you. And they either click block or accept. In this case, they accepted. And what they see is my name, and they see that it's external, but there's no email, right? There's nothing that tells the user what the email is that's messaging them, which is very interesting. And so I send them this document. We'll run this real quick. I send them a document, and they open up this document, and you would think this would work, but it doesn't. The reason why is because by default, you notice here that it opened up in a browser, right? So, but yeah, by default, when you open up a document in Teams, it opens up in the browser. There are ways to get around that, particularly if you're messaging from an internal perspective, like from one user inside of a tenant to another. But um, to make this short and just for the presentation, we're going to say that we linked to some Azure storage account and just have the user download the document directly. Right. So instead of uh, this document in Teams, right now I'm sending them a message. I'm typing, hey, can you check this document? This looks like WV1T3 files, right? So it looks like it's coming from them, just a little social engineering. They download the document, open up in Word, and then they hit enable editing. Why? Because in here I just say hello, but like you want like a real Phish, it'll be like, hey, enable the content or something like that, like something to get the user to actually do it. Here I just typed hello for the presentation. Now what's happening here, and I'm going to pause it so maybe you can see right at the bottom, there's an email being sent. You don't really like, you wouldn't be able to know, like if you saw Outlook pop up like in your tray table, you wouldn't think anything of it. But what's actually happening is when they clicked enable content, I grabbed all the access tokens, and now I'm sending that email out, right, via Outlook. So we got the tokens, they got emailed back to me. There's different audiences, right, for the different types of tokens. Anything that starts with EYJ0EX, right, is interesting. And you get all these different audiences: Outlook, Substrate, API, and there's some others. But the Outlook and Substrate tokens have mail read all, mail rewrite, and mail send. And so if we grab those, that means we can send emails as the user. So there's lots of different tokens and lots of different ways to get tokens. Um, and this is just a demonstration of how to do it sort of in an Azure AD only environment where you may not necessarily have the ability to uh, uh, pivot around a network or something like that in the more traditional sense. So yeah, this is an example. And I think that is the end of my talk because I think I'm a few minutes over and I don't want Michaela to get mad at me. So uh, Couple takeaway points. The approach for attacking AD environments is very different than AD. If you are trying to maneuver your way around AAD environments, then you're looking for access and refresh tokens primarily, right? Instead of using it, you can look for username and passwords, but access and refresh tokens are post-MFA, and those are where you really win things. And then the lateral movement, right, is a different train of thought, how to get from one device to another. Social engineering is a key component of attacking AD environments. So if you are in an engagement where they only have Azure AD and they say that social engineering is not in scope, they're really making your job more difficult, and they're also making it unrealistic, right? Because social engineering is the best way to get around Azure AD environments, cloud environments, right? Same thing for like if you were attacking a G Suite environment, right? Social engineering is where it's at because what domain do people with G Suite have? Right, none, right? Really. So you have to be creative in the way that you attack things. There's a lot of room for research in this area, and I highly recommend if you're interested in attacking Azure environments, that you go ahead and look up those people that I mentioned before. I don't really think I have time for questions and answers, but I also don't see any additional questions beyond the ones that I answered before. So I'm going to assume everything's all good, unless someone has like a really cool question or if I have time. But I will be in uh, the lobby, right? If you have a question, you want to ask me outside of this, and yeah, thank you for coming to the talk. So again, I am Leron from Bishop Fox. Here's my Twitter, my Mastodon, if you like using Mastodon, and my LinkedIn. If you add me on LinkedIn, just send me a note of that you that you listen to this talk. That because I get a lot of notifications on LinkedIn and I don't really pay attention to most of them. So if you send me an invite on LinkedIn, just give me some context, please. And I think that is all that I have. So I don't know which host is around, but yeah.